Welcome everyone to Media and Communications first ever webinar. Today we'll be discussing some of the main issues and challenges of today's online communication, such as the spreading of fake news, misinformation, or hate speech. This webinar and today's topic is based on a thematic issue published in Media and Communication early this year, entitled Dark Participation Online, the World of the Wicked Web. And we are in great company to approach and engage on this topic. We have Thorsten Quandt from Münster University, the academic editor of this issue, and then three of the authors: Herbert Chang from the University of Southern California, Svetlana Bodrunova from St. Petersburg State University, and Nahema Marchal from the Oxford Internet Institute. We also have the pleasure of welcoming our discussant today, Claes de Vreese from the University of Amsterdam and president of the International Communication Association. To all, thank you very much for joining us. Before we kick off this webinar, allow me to provide you all with some information on how this event will proceed. So Thorsten will go first, and then we will have the authors, and finally Claes, as our discussant, is commenting on the findings and provide some critical remarks on the topic. To our audience, I remind you that a Q&A format is available in the bottom of your screen, so feel free to write your questions throughout the session, which will be passed on to the speakers in the end. Without further delay, we are on time. I wish everyone a pleasant webinar. Thorsten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and it's a great honor to be here today. And I'm really excited to see some of the authors of the special issue on dark participation united here, even if it's not in real life, but virtual, as it is these days. But as always with such a project, you don't meet the others, but you work through email, especially so in these coronavirus times. So it's actually lovely to do this webinar, and I'm really glad that the publisher proposed this to us and to talk about the special issue on dark participation. I was briefly introduced, but I just want to mention a few things and introduce myself. I'm a professor of online communication at the University of Münster in Germany, and I do research on participation in online media and social media, journalism for more than 20 years now. Lately, I've done also some research on populism and propaganda, cyberbullying, and even VR and games. So looks like a weird combination, but I don't think so. So kind of a split personality, but I try to unite these two sides. Also kind of responsible for the term dark participation. I think I need to mention that. And responsibility is really a double-edged sword here. Something we might talk about in a minute, whether it's really good and appropriate term or not. The concept was, I think, first introduced in an article in Media and Communication in 2018. And I think that was the starting point also for this special issue, because when I was approached by Media and Communication about doing a special issue, I was thinking, what would be fitting. And this article in 2018 really produced a lot of reactions, positive ones, but also negative ones. Some people actually hated it. So I thought it's a really good idea to do a special issue on that. If some people love it and some people hate it, it might trigger a debate. Yeah, so what is the special issue about? What is dark participation about? What is that? And what can we learn about it from this special issue? As I said, the concept goes back a few years, and for me, it's also tied to a few personal experiences in academia that actually go back probably 20 years. So I will do a very bad thing for a scientific presentation and talk about my own personal experiences for a few minutes, but I think it's appropriate here, and hopefully I'm forgiven for doing that. As I think I really mentioned it for the first time in that piece. And that piece was, and that's the funny thing about it, was written on sabbatical in Stanford in 2018 for this special issue in Media and Communication, edited by my wonderful colleague Oscar Westlund from Oslo Met. And he approached me and said, can you write something about participation? And I was sitting there under a palm tree or eucalyptus tree in Stanford, drinking cappuccino, and thought, what can I do here in this utopian place? And really, Stanford is a utopian place in many ways, and you can feel this start up and let's change the world spirit everywhere, you know, when you go there. And so I guess it's no coincidence that this led me to reflect on the research on participation that many of us pursued at the beginning of the 2000s, which had a really similar feel in a way to Stanford, you know, that there were these expectations that were really high back then. Many of us were hoping that citizen participation would change the world, or at least journalism. And with journalism, maybe democracy and how we live together, that we would see a renewed democracy. And really, we were all hoping for utopian times in a way. In hindsight, I have to say, many of these expectations were somehow a bit naive, I would say, and followed a pretty narrow normative idea what people should do and how the world should look like. You could call this, in a way, academic wishful thinking. You know, there were some ideas that supported that, and some events also, like the early Arab Spring. So when we saw that, we thought, oh, you see, you know, participation actually changes the world. Fast forward, just a good decade later, we see the total opposite of this in social media and journalistic fora. We see this, what I call the evil flip side of early ideas, which I labeled dark participation, where people really participate for other reasons than what we hoped for. And I use dark participation to really express this change in perspective, in change in content, and also change in tone. Dark participation is really an umbrella concept for a range of sinister forms of participation that we saw, like trolling, bullying, strategic manipulation, up to large-scale disinformation campaigns. And I tried to differentiate it according to actors, reason, objects, intended audiences, and process back then. But there's something really important about that concept. It was never meant as a concept to replace the early utopian ideas and say everything's doom and gloom now, but it was more, I think that would be a misunderstanding. And indeed, some people actually took it like that. I think they didn't read the full article, because really dark participation was meant as a balancing tool in a way to these earlier utopian ideas. So I really painted the world in pitch black as a kind of, you know, a mirror trick in a way to counter that early utopian idea. I don't want to spoil the fun for the ones who haven't read the article, because there's one or two kind of things I did on purpose in that article that would be really a spoiler if I mention it in here. But even in that first article on dark participation, I really was, you know, warning about repeating or mirroring the earlier fallacies of research. You know, that we just focus now on the dark side, whereas before we would, you know, just focus on the light side in a way. You feel there's a certain science fiction feel to that as well. You know, I love Star Wars, but so what I think what we need to do is we need to recalibrate our viewpoints and normative ideas here, our expectations of what people should and can do. But that doesn't mean that we should lose hope in people, you know, that everything's bad now. It's just that we shouldn't be, you know, just utopian in a way. So I think these are two extreme points, the dark and the light side of participation. I think there's the truth somewhere in between. So the special issue was really meant as a further exploration of that. And I was really hoping for, as an academic editor, that we see diverse articles, you know, that show us the motivations, that why people do dark participation, also the functional side of dark participation, because that's very often overlooked. That it's not just evil, that there are reasons for its existence, why people are doing it, and why it makes a lot of sense for some participators in online communication to actually follow these, what we would call sinister goals. And I was really hoping for nuance and differentiation, and the submissions were doing so much more than that, actually. And I strongly urge the audience to read the whole issue, as it's a very fine selection of pieces that does much more than I did in the initial article a few years ago. There's another aspect about the special issue that also makes it very important for me personally, but I think also very important for everybody who's interested in that. It came to life in a very special time, and we all know which, you know, that time, because we are still experiencing it. It was a time of monumental change on a global basis. And when the project started, I think the notion of dark participation was probably tied to ideas of strategic manipulation by nations or hate campaigns by supporters of extreme political ideologies, something that we have seen growing, for example, during the refugee crisis in Europe. But then, something else happened, and we all know what happened. Coronavirus happened, and what we saw in that time, from the planning to the final stages of the special issue was amplified polarization, insecurities, across the globe, hate and fear campaigns. And we saw a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation happening. We saw a mob storming the Capitol building just earlier this year. And I think this is not unrelated to the topic we're talking about today. And indeed, I see strong links to what the authors in that special issue were writing about. And maybe we can come back to that in the discussion later on. So indeed, I think that topic is more relevant than ever, and actually more relevant than I planned for, when I started planning that special issue. So I really think that the research in that special issue is dearly needed. And I'm glad we have so many authors here today that will let you know about their work and their findings from that special issue. And I think I will keep it short and leave more time for the authors to present their work. And I will end my personal remarks on that. I'm really looking forward to their input. Thank you. So I'm not sure who's next in line. I think Herbert.
Herbert, go first.
Yes. Yes. Does my microphone work all right? Great. All right. So thanks so much for that introduction. My name is Herbert Chang. I'm a current PhD student at the University of Southern California, Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. I also work extensively with the Information Sciences Institute as part of the Ferrara Lab. So we've looked recently at a lot on the COVID-19 misinformation in the US elections. This project in the special issue about Taiwan and the 2020 Taiwanese presidential election in many ways was sort of a premonition of all the things that happened in the latter half of 2020. And so I'd just like to start a bit about my personal motivations for why I thought Taiwan would be an interesting case study. First, Taiwan is, according to Freedom House, one of the freest regions in Asia, yet it receives some of the highest concentrations of foreign misinformation or disinformation. As Professor Quandt was saying, there has been a shift between state manipulation. One of the main reasons why I felt it was interesting is because both the sources and the resistance against misinformation are both citizen-led. So research has shown that nationalized citizens from China had jumped over the infamous Great Firewall to lead pro-Chinese discourse. And to preface a little, in Taiwan, a group of volunteers and civic activists, as they like to call themselves, came together to create a fact-checking chatbot together. The second sort of core topic that I want to discuss is because so much of Taiwan's politics revolves around its relationship to China and foreign disinformation, when does the regulation of foreign disinformation become censorship of domestic discourse? Right. And so in our study, we basically looked at three primary platforms. The first is Line. Line is sort of like a chat room based app similar to WhatsApp. About 84% of Taiwanese people use it. And so for one, this is a very different public sphere than say Twitter or Facebook that has a much more publicness to it. We also look at the discourse on Twitter, which has a much larger international presence, and also PTT, which is short for Professional Technology Temple, which is a bulletin board often compared to be the Reddit of Taiwan. Just to give a little bit of context regarding the elections and politics in Taiwan, the first elections happened in 1996, and since then there were two dominant parties that emerged. One was the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. The second is the Kuomintang, which is the Nationalist Party, which came to Taiwan in 1949 following World War II. It's sort of useful for those unfamiliar to think of these as Democrats and the Republicans. For those familiar with Taiwan, it's sort of an inaccurate depiction, so I apologize for that. This year, well, 2020, well, time flies really quickly. I'm still stuck in 2020. So the DPP put up incumbent President Tsai Ing-wen as their primary candidate, and the Kuomintang put up Han Kuo-yu. Han Kuo-yu in particular deserves his own mention because of his nickname as the Trump of Asia or the Trump of Taiwan. He, like Trump, was a relatively unknown business person, and then was sent by his party KMT to the city of Kaohsiung, which has traditionally been the stronghold of the DPP. Somehow, well, the chairman of the KMT himself had very, very low expectations of his performance, but he ended up sweeping the entire city and essentially flipping that core city. And he did it through two ways. When you ask anyone from Kaohsiung what they know about Han Kuo-yu, there's two things. One is his slogan, which is simply "get rich," and the second is his gleaming bald head. And so these two things strangely bear a lot of resemblance to Donald Trump. The first is his focus on economic policy, get rich, speaking towards a desire for the industrial era of Taiwan. And the second is he intentionally used his bald head as almost as viral content in a similar way that Donald Trump is an entertainer on Twitter, and so hence generating a lot of free media. Yeah, and so not to get too deep into the Taiwanese politics, so I'll just move quickly into the results. We can start with Line. Line, just to recap, is sort of the WhatsApp of Taiwan, with 84% penetration. So I want to talk about Line because one of the most interesting groups, GovZero, which is the group under the digital minister Audrey Tang of Taiwan. This group created a fact-checking chatbot. And the way it works is, say, for instance, your mom sends you something sketchy that you don't really believe in. You want to verify whether this piece of news is true on Line. The way you would use it is you would forward this piece of information to the Line chatbot, which would then send it to a database. The database would then return one of four possible responses. The first is, this is misinformation, it's opinion, it's fact, or it's not relevant. If the piece of information does not exist within the database, then a group of volunteers will vet that information, fact check it, include it in the database, and return the response that way. And so this is a completely sort of citizen-led approach to fact checking, specifically for a platform in Taiwan where that's focused on vetting misinformation behind closed doors. Regarding the main takeaway from this platform, I'm going to be talking about the main takeaway from each of these individual platforms. For Line, this was that the traditional media was actually a large source of misinformation. So the most popular sources, such as United Daily or Liberty Times, these very popular traditional media sources played a big part in terms of promulgating misinformation. Now moving to PTT. PTT, unlike Line, is more open, but is still focused on domestic discourse because most people that post in it do so in Mandarin Chinese. Just with a quick, also to mention about Kofax, the Kofax database is entirely free, and you can download the entire database online basically from GitHub and do analysis yourself as well. So it's a completely transparent database. For PTT, we actually had to scrape basically a month of content around the elections. And once we did a semantic analysis, we found, sort of as expected, issues about freedom and self-determination were the central topics. Of particular interest, though, was the mention of Hong Kong as a central topic because of the Hong Kong protests in 2019. This became a big focal point in terms of the elections. The main takeaway from analyzing PTT was that citizen users from China, part of the PTT data set includes the IP address of every single post. And so that allows us to do to geolocate where each post originates from. We found that users from China focused on specific topics compared to others. So for instance, they focused on China, issues about Hong Kong and the incumbent President Tsai. but sort of ignored issues of COVID-19. So this sort of selective discourse from citizen participations was a finding that we had. Moving on to Twitter. Twitter is sort of the most international of these platforms. We had two main takeaways. The first is that we did an analysis on the users. This is on whether a user is a human or a bot. For users that are bots, these were mostly users from outside of Taiwan and also typed in simplified Chinese. And so we sort of located these two characteristics of bots. When we did a network analysis, we also found that two things. One is the DPP completely dominates Twitter. There's very little KMT presence. And also there's a lot of solidarity across 3 different regions. So Taiwan has strong, the DPP in particular has strong solidarity with Thailand, with Hong Kong, and with Japan. And so sort of the main takeaways is that during Taiwanese elections, the social issues are always overshadowed by policy issues with China. And there are, as I foreshadowed sort of in the beginning of the presentation, there were 2 things I'd like to discuss further. First is how should we theorize and deal with civil citizen participation from abroad. Recently, Clubhouse, which is the app where you can listen in on discussions, before it was taken down by app stores and by the App Store in China. There's some really good conversations going across straits. So participation in this case was good, and the intention does matter. And so in my mind, at least, dark participation is more useful than terms such as misinformation, which I feel has an overemphasis on the verity of information. The second, and related, is to what extent censorship should be made to deflect foreign interference. The prior National Communications Commission's director said something before she stepped down, which was that disinformation is the enemy of an open and democratic society, but they might lose that open society by trying to fight against it. And so I think refining dark participation as a concept in this case can help us better understand the types of policy by considering concepts such as civility beyond just the content and the intent. Yeah. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Herbert, thank you very much. Now, Svetlana.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm really delighted and honored to be on such a distinguished panel. And my first words will be those of gratitude to Thorsten, and who edited the special issue, and Sylvia Weisbord, who told Thorsten we were there. And of course, media and communication, especially Raquel Silva and Rodrigo Silva, who worked upon the papers and organized the webinar, just as to other staff of media and communication who worked upon my own special issue, who I co-edited with Alessia Kaltsova, who's here in the audience, in 2019. Today I present here the paper titled Constructive Aggression, Multiple Roles of Aggressive Content in Political Discourse on Russian YouTube. My co-author Anna Litvinenko from Freie Uni Berlin is also here. Hi, Anna. And mathematicians Ivan Blekanov and Dmitry Nepyushik have worked with the data. We're grateful to them. This research belongs to Center of International Media Research at St. Petersburg State University, which I've been leading since last year. So how have we come to the idea of constructive aggression in online discussions? Aggressive behavior, verbal behavior, is a widespread phenomenon, we all know it, and just as widespread are the academic works that aim at detecting and filtering out hate and offensive speech, obscene language, and other types of communicative aggression. Even the dilemma hate speech versus free speech only demands defining what lexicon to ban from public use. However, a small handful of works points out to constructive functions of aggression in discriminated communities, such as LGBTQ, for example. Also in psychological literature, there are dozens of functions of aggressive speech, such as expressing discontent, showing helplessness, or venting anger. Also, our earlier research gave some hints that aggressive speech might actually fuel discussions and work as a discussion spurring, so to say, agent. Thus, we felt hate speech was not that simple. And I would say if the first stage was utopia, the second stage was dystopia, this is sort of a third stage, like a more nuanced view, more pragmatic view, and closer to life on how these forms of communication actually work. We felt that not least because we were speaking native Russian. As it is widely known, Obscene lexicon of Russian, called mat, is quite a highly developed sublanguage that in some cases can nearly substitute normal speech. And in the current conditions of deep fragmentation and political polarization of the Russian society, hybrid lexemes that unite political realities and mat have appeared on both sides of political spectrum, and they're quite widespread. For example, Kremled, where you clearly hear Kremlin, Kreml, and Liberast, where you hear liberal, for example. This in itself told us we needed to look at this type of under-researched political hate speech. To do this, we used the case of protests during the electoral campaign to the Moscow City Parliament, Mosgorduma, in July to September 2019. We looked at comments to the most popular oppositional videos on YouTube, because YouTube in the recent years has become an alternative to TV for many Russians, on which an hour ago, Social Media and Society published a paper by Anna Litvinenko, my co-author. The news just came an hour ago, which and congratulations to Anna. Thus, we asked ourselves what roles mat and political hate speech would play in the YouTube commenting. The first research question was about the role in the discussion dynamics, sort of a formal role, whether harsh speech spurs or slows down the discussion. And the second RQ was of a sort of exploratory nature. We looked at what functions hate speech might play in commenting in sociological and psychological terms. We assembled 15 YouTube videos, most popular of those period, on politics in Russia, and could collect comments under 13 of them due to several reasons. Altogether, nearly 78,000 comments. We collected and analyzed them with the help of our patented web crawler with additional modules for dataset analytics. And with the collected data set, we needed to automatically detect harsh speech. After several rounds of checks, we have ended up with 3 types of offensive language: non-political obscenities and their euphemisms, anti-state lexicon, and anti-oppositional lexicon. Anti-state, one compared police first and foremost during the protests to garbage, regime lapdogs and KGB, institutions and the regime itself to Nazis, Tsarist gendarmerie and mafia, beside everything else. And anti-oppositional lexicon humiliated liberalism and democracy as shitocracy, democratia, and portrayed oppositionists as internal betrayers, linking them to the US grant funding, the orange threat of the Ukrainian-like revolution, and gay Europa, which is sort of LGBT favoring Europe. So it was the value-based lexicon which delineated the borders between the groups. We detected all the posts that contained the 3 lexicons and performed Granger tests for defining the role in the spurring the discussion, and for the second RQ, we just did qualitative content analysis and discourse analysis. And by that, we have found the following. First, Granger tests showed that the number of comments may grow under the impact of harsh language. And this effect was the strongest for anti-oppositional speech inside oppositional speech, and for activist commentative videos, not news. We have also seen that, contrary to some very rare works on constructive aggression in small groups, harsh speech disappeared when micro-dialogues started to form in the discussion, but grew in individual sparse expressions of opinion, which helped the dominant mood of commenters grow. Both non-political and political harsh speech was nearly everywhere. It was not just rare occasional use of harsh words. It was used by practically the majority of commenters. Even more interesting were the functions of harsh speech within the comments. First of all, anti-state and anti-oppositional lexicons served, of course, to demarcate us versus them. But more intriguing, we have spotted how solidarity in condemnation was expressed, and as I told, grew comment by comment. Both these functions helped the formation of sort of counter-publics, and sometimes the pro-state commenters were a minority within a bigger anti-state discourse, which is a rare case for Russia. Another significant function was contextualization. Aggressive anti-state critique put the current regime in a row of national traumas of the 20th century, especially it linked the current regime to the World War II, like to the Nazi regime, and uncontrolled capitalism of the frantic 90s, as people called it, united sort of by this underlying reference to dysfunctionality of the political scene captured by force. The anti-liberal critique also used its right to reinterpret the current history by radically addressing fears of yet another system revolt, post-Cold War cleavages in values, deep suspicion towards American and European intentions, and post-imperial resentment. So all this was there in the commenting, and especially was expressed by harsh speech. Here, post-Maidan Ukraine, for example, was often an example of a country destroyed by color revolution. So our research might shed some light on the recent attempts of the Russian state to ban offensive speech from mediated discourse, as actually, at least partly, these bans may be interpreted as attempts to deprive the opposition of a rare available means of consolidating and demarcating the countersphere. Interestingly, hate speech plays sort of a constructive role here. But the effect might actually have been the opposite, because after these legal bans for many online commenters, the very use of harsh lexicons is perceived as marking of zones of free speech, and people use it quite creatively, avoiding or like overcoming the bans by changing the words, for example. However, the state might do even worse to itself, as another function of harsh language in this discussion seems to be venting anger. It's quite clear from what we've seen. Thus, banning it might be sort of counterproductive for the regime itself. So the take-homes, so to say, from our research is that first we have seen that both political and non-political strong language is not just used occasionally, but sort of might form the fabric of YouTube discussions, of political videos, and it plays a handful of constructive democratic roles, which definitely demands more research. First, it drives online talk, but tends to sometimes disappear in dialogical situations, in micro dialogues that appears over there. Its use highlights the cumulative patterns of deliberation, for instance, the growing solidarity and condemnation, rather than dialogical patterns. And thus it puts under question the dialogical nature of online discussions where people just express themselves. We will be working further upon two aspects: this political or public sphere functions of strong language in non-democratic contexts, and these cumulative patterns of deliberation. And I hope to have a paper written and published on this very soon. And of course, these types of speech, the special types of speech like dark participation speech, gonna definitely play a decisive role in this cumulative deliberation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Svetlana. Nahema, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks, Svetlana and Herbert, for some very interesting presentations on your research. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning, and thanks for the publisher again for organizing this webinar. So by way of introduction, my name is Nahema Marchal, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the Oxford Internet Institute, where my work mostly focuses on the drivers of political and affected polarization. But I also do some research as part of the program on democracy and technology, looking at the societal implication of digital technology and social media, formerly known as the Project on Computational Propaganda. And so in the next 10 minutes, I'll give you a quick overview of our study, which is on investigating the use of visual media on Twitter in the aftermath or during the 2019 European election. And so from our perspective, with my co-authors, Lisa Maria Neudert, Bente Koliani, and Phil Howard, we took a slightly different approach, I would say, to the concept of dark participation, in that we were actually interested in illuminating a type of content that is often, overlooked in the study of online political communication, and that's the use of visuals. We had previously collected, a number of tweets as part of a study that we conducted on the use of information sources and the types of information sources that were shared on Twitter as part of the election. And in the same process, we ended up collecting all of the visual information that was shared with these tweets. And so we wanted to really gain an understanding, given that there's little research being done on this, of how visuals were mobilized by Twitter users across two different types of conversation, perhaps a more mainstream conversation that focused on the discussion of the 2019 EU election around some of the official hashtags, and a more fringe political conversation that focused specifically on potential exit from the European Union. And we thought that to be a fitting comparison in the sense that the election itself took place against a backdrop of a lot of divisions in public attitudes about the EU. And indeed, the rise of populism in Europe in the past couple of years had really stoked fears ahead of the 2019 parliamentary elections that there would be significant gains for Eurosceptic voices, and that they might be a lot of misinformation and disinformation circulating on various social media platforms ahead of the vote. And we decided to focus on Twitter as it's a widely used platform across different European publics, and one that is very much used in the context of election and referenda. And so we, like I mentioned, collected something like 3 million tweets covering a 2-week period. From that, we extracted all of these images and took some samples of it, and we ended up tapping into 6 different types of European languages: English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Swedish. And performed both a content and a thematic analysis of those visuals, starting from the premise that this work would necessarily be more exploratory and as well as descriptive. And we were trying to get a sense of both the types of formats that were being used by users, or the formats of the visuals that were being shared, focusing on the constitutive elements of these visuals. So we had categories ranging from photographs to illustrations, screen caps, posters. And then we, in the second instance, looked at the content, and the mode of communication itself. So here we, outline official campaigning material from satellite campaign material, where some of the official posters had been reworked and rearranged. The use of political humor, as well as expressions of citizen political engagement. So things that you might be familiar with, like ballot selfies, or people taking pictures of themselves canvassing. And so we very much took an inductive approach to this content analysis, in that we started from the data and the material itself, and we worked upwards to derive these categories. And in a third time, we looked at the themes that were common across these different types of images, focusing specifically on some of the policy content, as well as the position towards the EU. So some material was explicitly pro-European. Some of it was more conveying Eurosceptic messaging. For example, pictures of flags, being burnt of the European Union, versus images that clearly showed "I love EU" or this types of content. And in terms of the main findings, so we cover a lot of it in depth in the paper itself, but just some of the highlights. What was interesting to us is, against some of the fears, that preceded the vote, that there was going to be a tidal wave, essentially, of misinformation, potentially toxic content in the context of the vote. The great majority of the visuals that we found were official campaign material. That was the highest modal and format category across both of the conversations. Having said that, there were some interesting differences in the two discourses, and particularly the Twitter conversation around the exit of the European Union contained twice the amount of memes, for example, and twice the amount of politically humorous content as the more generic conversation. In contrast, the more generic conversation that focused on the discussion of the election itself had a lot of satellite campaigning material. And so we provide a longer definition of that in the paper, but what we mean by that is democratic intermediaries, so individuals who might, like I said, not be officially affiliated with a political party, but who will, use parts of a poster or maybe a signa from, one of the most mainstream parties to push maybe a more, partisan or a specific message. So a lot of those satellite campaigning materials were promoting a very pro-EU message. Whereas in the context of the exit dataset, as we refer to it, there was a lot of political humor being mobilized to push, Eurosceptic themes. So here, really, the use of composites and memes and GIFs and illustrations was put forward to essentially deter individuals from voting for pro-EU parties, and to indeed derogate sometimes members of the European Parliament, etc. We did find some what we would categorize as extreme content. Again, that would be, we found anti-Semitic or Islamophobic images, but these were mostly confined, again, to the fringe conversation. And we still, compared to some of the other categories, such as official campaigning material or even political engagement, so ballot selfies or pictures of campaign events, this was a really marginal part, essentially, of both conversation. And so in terms of the main takeaways from us from this study, we think that it was an illuminating first exercise in trying to better understand the forms of participation that take place online without necessarily going as far as imputing intent on the users. I think it's helpful to engage in this sort of descriptive work to also understand, well, what are we seeing at a particular moment in time, and what does it say essentially about the different modes of participation that people take online. And so in the context of the exit data set, that seemed to echo findings from the literature that political humor can often be a vehicle towards more radicalizing or extremist content. And so we saw reflections of that in our data set, but that overall, essentially, it's also valuable to be able to compare and contrast, and sometimes put into perspective the role that dark participation, or what we would consider, according to your definition, Thorsten, dark participation, in relationships to more mainstream participation. So if we obviously hone in and zoom in on the more toxic forms of content, whether that's text-based approaches or visual-based approaches, we're sure to illuminate some problematic aspects of the ways in which social media is used. But I think it's important to always also put that in a greater perspective of how people engage with these platforms. And of course, moving forward, I think it would be interesting to go beyond Twitter as a platform to study this. Visuals are omnipresent on so many different platforms these days, and they're increasingly mobilized for political aims. And so being able to even replicate some of the studies in the context of other platforms or do cross-platform comparisons, I think it's a valuable way forward. Start that.
Thank you very much, Nahema. And I believe now, Claes, there's some remarks on the topic.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thanks for putting together this this webinar, and also thanks to Thorsten for inviting me to write a short commentary in the special issue, because it was a good opportunity for me to actually read the different articles and also see a number of good things in there, that we are seeing studies that span different continents, that address different types of challenges, and thereby putting together an overall, I think, a very good and very diverse special issue. So congratulations both to Thorsten as editor and to the contributors for that. Of course, today we have a unique first webinar on this special issue, but as we've already learned, things can move fast. So while we're doing a webinar, we should have all, of course, now been meeting on Clubhouse to have this conversation about dark participation, but that's not happening today. And I want to highlight just a few things that to me stand out both in the special issue and also in the discussions today. So what's good about the special issue is that I think it really tries to come with a broad and comprehensive notion of what can fall under dark participation, right? So themes about disinformation and misinformation and how that plays out in different contexts is part of the special issue. We have articles that engage with political polarization, and especially paying attention to what political elites do in this space. As communication scholars, we look a lot at the impact of media and communication in this area and polarization on the side of citizens, but really a lot is needed to understand the role of political polarization on the side of political elites themselves. The special issue tackles issues of trust and distrust and different patterns that we see also in different countries, and it attacks the development of, you could say, civil or incivil discourse, and especially what the online environment has done to those developments. Those are no small topics to be taking on in a special issue, and that of course also means that one of the next things, and maybe the next generation of research that we have to pay attention to here within the broader umbrella notion of dark participation, are some of the following questions. So first of all, who are the groups that engage and who are affected by these kind of practices? We observe, I think, very well in the special issue that it plays out rather differently in different contexts and in different countries. But I believe more attention is needed to move the process forward from general discussions about the possibility to engage with darkness to being more specific about the groups that do this, that engage in these practices, and also the ones who are maybe most susceptible to these practices. A second question moving forward is the question of context and circumstances. The special issue is great because we see evidence, as we've seen also today, from diverse places in different continents, and that is really good in a field that is rather dominated by referring to the US or Western European examples. So that's wonderful achievement. But as we move forward, the next step will also be to be more explicit about those circumstances and the context and how they affect the boundary conditions for this to play out. A third question I think is also at the table, and some of the studies go into this, is unpacking more of the processes through which these participation types come into play and take effect. What are the motivations that are driving, and what are some of the processes, and of course the consequences at the very end, which refer back to some of the rather big notions of political polarization and developments in trust, etc. And I think a fourth question, which is not necessarily addressed yet in the special issue, but has come very much into play in probably in the interim time between when the studies were conducted and the special issue got published. And just as Thorsten reflected on how quickly things move in this space in his personal account at the outset of the webinar, I think we have also come into a situation where the role of and the question of government regulation vis-a-vis policies on the side of big tech and platforms have become much more important as also setting boundaries and conditions for how this plays out, right? When most of these studies were conducted, we were not in a situation where neither governments or regulators were really talking about taking steps towards big tech companies or platforms, Or were we in a situations where the big tech platforms had in fact themselves taken steps of trying to intervene in some of the expressions of darkness, as we have seen in only the last 6 months. So I think these are some of the important questions that should be asked in a next generation and a next maybe special issue on this topic, how these things play out in the identification of the different groups, the different circumstances, the explication of the processes, and this very important role of setting boundary conditions by both government and or self-regulation by big tech companies. In my commentary, I also make a plea for, which I will mention here, for not forgetting the light at the end of the dark tunnel, that there is maybe also in that pendulum between the utopia, the dystopia, and the question of what comes next, that we also have an important role as researchers to still point out some of the instances through which there can also be positive processes at play. And I think there are a number of good examples from colleagues that we can turn to this, or also some of our adjacent field work on family communication and youth and media communication have actually been quite good at also focusing at some of the positive outcomes. So let's not forget about this. And then maybe a final reflection that jives quite well with Thorsten's opening remarks, that this is also for us as researchers a moving field, and as someone who has also been engaged in studying political communication and journalism for more than 2 decades now, I definitely also see myself confronted with a different type of approach to some of the questions that are at stake now, right? So 2 decades ago, I think we spent a lot of time, and rightfully so, as scholars, questioning practices in the media, questioning practices in journalism, pointing out power relationships and economic dependencies in journalism. And I think a lot of us are now facing a situation where we are also having to all of a sudden, as scholars and as a research community, stand for some of the very things that we have maybe been questioning for a long time, and be vocal proponents for the need for having quality journalism and having actors in this area of darkness that does allow for a good public exchange. So I think it also is a topic that really reflects and invites also some thoughts on who we are as scholars and how we approach the topic that we are studying. I think with that, I'll leave my more sort of helicopter impressions and once again congratulate both the authors in the special issue and the editor with this great achievement.
Claes, thank you very much. Very precious remarks. Now I will go to the Q&A now. We have several questions from our audience. My suggestion is that some of the questions are directed to some of the speakers. So I will read the questions. The first, and then there's another question that is more general. So perhaps each and every one of you can then make your remarks on this one. The first one is for Nahema Marchal from Teresa Weichmann from University of Vienna. She asked, there's a great fear at the moment regarding visual disinformation spreading on social media, thinking of new technological developments like deepfakes here. And so to what extent do you think that visuals have a fertile ground on social media and even much more impact compared to textual disinformation? To Svetlana, Olesya asks, are you sure that obscene vocabulary is the same as hate speech? MAT is often used as just a highly emotional speech, not just necessarily as a means of personal attacks or hate against social groups. So is obscenity or really hate what you are finding? And the last question I then put to everyone, to all our speakers, is to what extent and perhaps Thorsten might start with this one, to what extent do the authors feel that their engagement with the concept of dark participation had to do with the reality created by the Trump regime and its international ramifications? What changes and what stays the same with regime change? So perhaps the first question to Nahema.
Well, thank you, Rodrigo, and thanks, Teresa, for the question. Let me try to provide a nuanced answer to that. So, of course, I think it's understandable that there are some concerns about the potency of visuals, given that we know from research that compared to text, visuals tend to be easier to process, that they tend to elicit stronger emotions and capture and retain people's attention. So there are some significant and important differences between the media effects of text and images. Having said that, I do believe that there's a slight disconnect between some of the fears and public concerns that surround these technological developments and the reality of what we're seeing. So, of course, deepfakes themselves are worrying. However, they do not represent, I think, the great majority of problematic visual information that's currently in circulation. Deepfakes is still very expensive to produce, the high quality ones, and the cheap ones are often quickly debunked by technologies that have also been developed in recent years to be able to flag them more easily. And so what we're seeing in large amounts are either cheap fakes, which again are very easily manipulated images. This is the kind of thing that you and I could do. Or you could think of this video of Nancy Pelosi, for example, that was only slowed down essentially to try and convey the impression that she was inebriated. And I would say the last category is the use of real images that have just been taken out of context, and they're placed in an environment in which the message that accompanies them, again, tries to convey, a different impression to the viewer. And so even being able to differentiate between these different types of manipulation of visuals, whether the visual itself is, accurate or not, is going to be important moving forward. And it calls also for more, I think, study and understanding of the relationship of the image to the context in which it is put. So, of course, I think that this should be an impetus for us to prioritize, visual politics moving forward in the field. Also, given that some of the tools and methodological approaches that are now available to us allow, for more systematic, large-scale analysis of images, but that should be complemented with, more qualitative engagement with, the context and the actors, and even engaging through interviews and conversations with the individuals who are sharing this type of content to try and solve the question of intent as well, which is at the core of the study of misinformation and disinformation. So I'll start with that.
Thank you. Svetlana, perhaps.
Yes, Olesa, thank you so much for your question, because yes, indeed, in Russian, obscene language sometimes is used just for expressing harsh emotions, so to say. It's just highly emotional speech. It's not that you're blaming someone or doing or just like hating someone by using this speech. But for our research, it was important because it was also expression of mood and opinion. It helped express opinion, not only emotion, because persons intentionally used such words in their speech because it's written language. Then it marked the free space for discussion. People felt they could use it despite all the bans. And sometimes, in more rare cases, it was really used for offense. But if we only focused on obscene lexicons, we would definitely miss the point, because the hybrid forms, which I told several examples, which I brought several examples into my speech, and political offensive speech, which was not obscene first and foremost, were the real carriers of hatred and discontent and opinion. And these types of speech is under research. This is exactly why we looked at it in our research. We took it in our research, because without doing this, we would just miss the point. And we compared obscene speech, which was usually perceived as the harshest, as the worst, so to say, to this political offense. And we realized that actually political offense was doing more for both discussion spurring and expressing opinion and this condemnation and solidarity in condemnation.
Thank you, Svetlana. Regarding the other question, perhaps we can start, Thorsten, from you.
Yeah, the question whether Trump was one of the main reasons here, actually, I don't think so. Actually, I think it goes a bit further back because Donald was a bit late. And I think we've seen first signs of that in Europe earlier, for example, the refugee crisis and some first examples of state interventions. We've seen that, actually at the turn of the first and the second decade. So I think Donald Trump was kind of an amplification of that. But from the European perspective, I don't think he was the main reason why we're talking about that. Lately, we've been talking about him a lot. I mean, there is a fascination in many countries in Europe with that person. And I think in Germany, we've seen that in the material. For example, last year, we've done a content analysis of Facebook posts from news media and alternative news media, and actually the main actor, the one person that was mentioned most in German media and Facebook was Donald Trump. Actually, not the German chancellor; she was actually on second. Donald Trump was number one, but I think he wasn't the reason. He was not the first person that actually kind of made this a large topic. I think the reasons for that are much earlier, at least when you approach it from a European perspective.
Thank you. I don't know if any of the speakers would like to also answer this question. Okay, because if not, we are receiving a lot of questions, which unfortunately we cannot answer them all. But we have received here one for everyone, and I think it's a great way to conclude this issue. It seems like the motto has been the issue is always evolving, the topic is always evolving, and so I will read you all this question, giving everyone, all of the speakers, 2 minutes to conclude. Okay, and the question is, what is the role that you as scientists have in this process? So should have a more active role or more in the shadows informing? So what is your takes on this? Feel free to step forward, any of you.
I guess everybody's too polite to start first. Why shouldn't Claes? You can start first as a commenter because you had the last in the last round, so you start.
Sure. Thanks. It's a great question, and I think it also sort of strikes a chord on where I ended the commentary by saying that our role is maybe also changing over the past couple of decades. But it's also a delicate one, right? Because we are in a process where part of some of the strategies that we see in this space is bringing questions about facts, scientific knowledge and insight into question, doubting the truthfulness and the balance of journalism. And that is also a space that we as scholars will have to navigate. And we have, of course, seen numerous examples over the past years too about scholarship and scholars being dragged into to strategies that belong to this space too. So we are probably in a situation where the role that we have is that we do have the distance and the responsibility to make sound analysis here and not to avoid becoming a too engaged direct commentator on ongoing things. Yet at the same time, I also believe that we are challenged to speak up and do so more than we were maybe two decades ago. But it comes with a risk. And there's also a self-organizing principles in that we need to think more about how we protect our, especially junior and minority scholars when they engage in these discussions, because we have seen it in recent years, how that easily then becomes a topic of aggression, much along what we have seen in spaces of journalism and politics itself. So the responsibility is there, but it is also one that comes with additional institutional responsibilities and a community responsibility.
I guess I can add to that by echoing Claes's point, but also saying that in my mind, the role of social scientists, particularly on some of these topics that are fast evolving and yet are the sources of constant fascination understandably by concerned citizens and public actors, is to provide, necessary nuance as we, gain more and more understanding of these complex issues. And I think it's, links back to the whole metaphor of dark versus light. In this world where things can be painted very much as overly dystopian or overly utopian, social scientists should, help guide the way and provide, sound, robust analysis and nuance to these topics to make sure that, the public is also well informed about how that's evolving. And
if I could add just a couple of words, from a society where academic achievement is not always demanded by the society and by the elites, I would say that we still have to be there despite the absence of demand sometimes, and we still have to say a word, because this means that there's someone to say what's really happening. Even when we encounter propaganda or political polarization or social trauma, social neuroses that actually rule sometimes public behavior. So here we are to be sort of the part of the irrational, so to say, the rationalization of what is going on. And we just can hope to be in demand by the society now or in future.
If you don't mind me adding a few words here from a, I guess, younger perspective, maybe. I think there was a recent study that came out that said, like, studies that come out faster have lower quality in terms of like scientific value. So speedy response doesn't necessarily imply like good response. And as social scientists, preserving truth value is sort of the main goal. And so to buy that time, I think social scientists might be able to take a more proactive role in terms of assessing what a new technology might for instance, what happens when social media is integrated with VR coming up in 2 years. That's a question you can tackle now rather than when it comes out. And for instance, a lot of these issues can be both timely and timeless. When you're regulating things like hate speech compared to, say, political misinformation, which is a timely issue. These standards, for instance, that are upheld by Facebook, these are timeless issues that sort of resonate with ideals of democracy that can be addressed regardless of the social technology in question. Yeah, and so I guess working more directly with the social media companies in this case would be sort of the solution. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your remarks. Apparently, a lot of research coming very soon. I would like to conclude. I'm sorry, we have a lot of questions which we cannot answer, but we thank everyone for putting them and for watching this webinar. Two concluding remarks before we close this webinar. The first one is that a record of this webinar will be available in our YouTube channel. Both attendees who were and who could not attend will have access to this link, and we will also share it in our social media accounts. Second remarks, so this issue, Dark Participation Online, is available in our website, fully open access, so each and every one of you can access, read, cite, share with everyone anytime. I now conclude this webinar, thanking all the speakers for making this possible and thanking the attendees for their participation, and stay tuned for the next webinar. Thank you.